I'm Steve, I'm blind, and welcome to the Blind Gamer Podcast. In today's episode, as you could probably tell by the title of this video slash podcast slash audio thing, we're going to be talking a lot about Red Dead Redemption 2 today. This is actually a spoiler cast for Red Dead Redemption 2. I wanted to be able to do this, and you may be kind of wondering, Steve, why are you doing this now and not like a year ago when it came out? Well, here's the thing. So it kind of ties into sort of the accessibility side of things that that it was harder for me to be able to play at the beginning, but I'll get into that in a sec. And then also I kind of thought, you know what? It just recently came out for PC. People are starting to be able to play it again, with Red Dead Online being a thing that people are jumping into as well. And of course, people probably picking this up over the holidays over the past little bit. They're probably playing this for the first time. So even though it's not like trending as far as the Google Trends sort of thing, I figured, you know what, I just recently played it, I want to talk about it, and I need to kind of get this out while it's still fresh in my mind after playing this. So that's kind of where this episode's going to go. I'm going to basically talk about my history with Red Dead. I'm going to talk about the accessibility, kind of where I thought about the story and the ending with the epilogue, and sort of my thoughts about all of that. And we're going to try to be able to, I'm going to try to touch on as much as I can. I am only one person, so there's a lot of things that I did miss. There's a lot of missions I didn't go on that probably would have been an amazing sort of could have had some amazing moments within the game. I just didn't get to because I was mainly kind of like mainlining the story. But I'll get into that in a little bit. First off, I kind of wanted to at least kind of give my history with Red Dead Redemption. So I actually played the original Red Dead. Wow, it's actually a green, or it's a red box. I forgot. Yeah, this is a green box, not a red box. So this is not my original copy of Red Dead Redemption. I wish I still had my original copy, but I sold it years ago. Well, actually, what I did like about it though is that it still has, when I purchased this, it still has the original map. I don't even know if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see at least majority of this. But if you're listening to this on a podcast, you might want to be able to check it out on YouTube, just to be able to see this sort of map here. I know it's sort of like cut off because of the green screen, but whatever. And then there's also this picture on the back, which is pretty cool. I've been looking for a copy of it, making sure for a long time after I sold mine. I wanted to make sure that I had the map still that came with it. So I'm glad at least the copy that I did pick up had this. But I remember picking up Red Dead Redemption in I'd say the beginning part of 2011. I actually technically I picked it up on Boxing Day 2010. For those who don't know, if you don't live in Canada or in the UK, essentially Boxing Day, it's the day after Christmas, and usually there's a lot of big sales happening on that day. It's technically like the Canadian version, our Canadian version of Black Friday. Although now we have Black Friday and Boxing Day, so we technically get two actually kind of really big sales, but it's whatever. And I picked it up because it was pretty cheap, and I wasn't too interested in it at first because I was never really interested in the Grand Theft Auto games that Rockstar was known at the time. So having this as sort of like another extension, I thought it was going to be basically just Grand Theft Auto with westerns, and I love westerns too much that I was like, you know what, I don't really want to be a bad guy. I don't want to be an outlaw in this Western world and having to be able to basically the stereotypical sort of way and the sensationalized version of what the West was. I kind of wanted a little bit more something realistic and not necessarily having to be able to go into each town and just like shoot up a bunch of saloons and sleep with a lot of the prostitutes in the saloon and then make my way out or whatever. And at the time, that's kind of what Grand Theft Auto really was, and that was sort of my perception of it. Anyway, I'm gonna take a coffee real quick. So that was kind of my interpretation of what Red Dead Redemption was going to be, and I knew it was sort of a sequel of Red Dead Revolver. I mean, sort of. I mean, I knew that it sort of shared the same name, and I kind of figured it was a sequel or something. but I didn't know much about it. And I thought, you know what? I'm an adult. I'm living on my own. I was living in a very small town in Ontario, Canada, and I figured, you know what? I had an Xbox 360. I'll pick it up and then I'll start playing it. And I fell in love with it. It was completely not what I expected. Rockstar San Diego at the time put in a lot of effort to make sure that this story was, or this game was as close to sort of like a really good Western story as best as possible, and in the grand form of like a spaghetti Western or like a literary Western, like kind of like the original 310 to Yuma. You may probably know that from the movie, but 310 to Yuma was a book. It was a short story. I think it was a short story. I can't remember if it was a full-blown novel or if it was just if it was a book. Actually, I thought that the author in this. In the game, Evelyn Miller that you meet in Saint Denis was it was Elmore. I can't remember the name's. I'm blanking on the name right now, but I thought that Evelyn Miller was that author, and it could be just basically an homage to that guy because I think Elmore Leonard, I think was the name, and he wrote a lot of Western novels. So Red Dead Redemption had that feel to it, and they really. Rockstar San Diego put so much effort into the story, making sure that it was a great, amazing tale, and it just even the gameplay and itself. So I fell in love with it, and it became one of my favorite games of all time. Actually, at a certain point, it was my favorite game of all time. That was until Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild came out, and that kind of. Actually, you know what? I don't really have my all-time favorite game of all time. I have favorites, but I don't have favorite. But I will say Red Dead Redemption. I was very, very, very much that was I kind of held that in high regard. And then when I heard about Red Dead Redemption 2, when that came out, or when this came out, it was like, or it was announced, I was very, very excited. The fact that we were getting a sequel, the fact that they've been working on it for 5 years. At that point, I was like, yes. I'm in. I didn't care what it was. I thought I could be able to play it, and I was excited to be able to play it. And actually, if you go into the archive of my YouTube channel, youtube.com/snowball, you can be able to see my first playthrough, at least the first hour or so of Red Dead Redemption 2. And unfortunately, that this is like right after it came out. Like honestly, because this copy right here that I hold in my hands, it's a PS4 copy. This has been sitting on my shelf for a while. I purchased this. I pre-ordered this. I bought this day one when it came out, and I started playing it. I played it for my YouTube channel, and then I got to about chapter 2, and then I stopped. And I hadn't touched it for basically a year. Mainly because of the accessibility. And so I'm going to talk about the accessibility about this, and this, like I said, this leads into sort of why I stopped playing. And that the accessibility in this game is still pretty poor. It's not like now picking it up a year later it got easier, or it was far suited, like better for my disability. It's not like they improved it with any updating patches or whatever. It just I was able to, like, there were certain things that I was able to upgrade technology wise to be able to help make it a little bit easier for me to be able to play, but not in regards to the game itself. Unfortunately, a Rockstar for me in this instance was not able to put in any accessibility options in this game, at least that were specifically designed for accessibility. Subtitles, to a certain degree, yes, and I did like that the subtitles you can have turned on pretty much all the time whenever you're talking to anybody and there's dialogue. You can see the tag of the person who's speaking, and even when people are talking over each other, it kind of does a cool little like lower contrast of someone talking underneath you and the most important dialogue over top. And it was so. And there's that. I'd say there's a lot. There's a few accidental accessibility features, and I say accidental because I don't know whether or not it was intentional, but it was at least there are certain things that helped make the gameplay a little bit easier for me to jump into. Mainly being the auto aim was a big help. So basically, how that worked was that if you push the L2 button, this is on the PS4 specifically, hit the L2 button to go into sort of aim mode, and if your reticle is near an enemy, it'll just automatically lock on to that enemy, and you can be able to use R2 to fire, and that helped a lot, especially when I was like in behind cover and there was a group of enemies kind of attacking me. I can just sort of like before I even jumped up, I knew sort of where an enemy was to a certain degree, and I just sort of would pop up, immediately hit L2, and then it would auto aim to that person. And then in order for me to be able to get a headshot, I knew enough that I could just sort of, if I flicked up the right thumbstick just a little bit, it generally, because the auto aim would hit the chest, like that's pretty much where it would always auto aim to. But if you flicked up a little bit, you can generally get a headshot majority of the time. There was a lot of times where I had missed, and even the special like little bonuses that you get, check marks that you get at the end of each mission, and there was a lot of like being able to hit with 80% accuracy or get this X amount of headshots or whatever. There's a lot of times I didn't get those, but I was able to get a lot more headshots than I probably would in any other game, I sort of call that as like, even though it probably wasn't labeled as accessibility feature, I did appreciate that was in the game. One thing I still am very, it was hard for me to even in this current playthrough that I did, it was hard for me to play, was the low text size, or small text size. And we've talked about it a lot over the past year, even in games that the big sort of AAA titles that even people without a visual disability, it was hard for them to be able to see the text without having to lean a little bit closer to their screen in order to be able to see. And this was kind of like the beginning stages of those kind of AAA titles, and it was more about the developers. The Rockstar, it seemed like that they were more interested in getting rid of a majority of the HUD as possible, so you could be able to see the gorgeous environment. And I've actually heard conversations of developers who think that way, that they think that they should just have a very limited HUD and make everything as small as possible, so that everyone can enjoy the artistic environments. And unfortunately, it's not like as gorgeous as it can be, it's not the greatest when it comes to pushing accessibility forward. So the fact that everything was a little bit smaller and also was pushed off to the far corners, especially now that when you have like very large televisions and you're playing games on these large TVs, it is hard to be able to put things in the UI that are into the far corners, mainly because your vision, even just if like you don't even have a disability, essentially your vision is kind of more focused on the center of the screen majority of the time, because that's where your player is. That generally is where your reticle is for for a first person shooter. It generally everything is happening in the center of the screen, and being able to have to look off into different directions, you actually have to physically either look that way, or just you have to something has to catch your eye in order to be able to see it. And for some people who don't have a disability, being able to kind of look casually at a certain thing and be able to read it real quickly, that's a blessing, and that's awesome if you can do that. For me, unfortunately, no. And I sort of use this example a lot, even when I've been talking about sort of the when people ask sort of what games have pretty low accessibility for you, and I use this as an example where, because everything is like the dialogue options or the interactive menus in the HUD are pushed to the bottom right corner, and the text is pretty small. And when I first sort of was getting used to it, when I started playing, it was at the very beginning. This is not really a spoiler, but you're basically in the mountains. You're in a blizzard at night, and you're following Dutch to do the next bit of the mission without really spoiling anything in the story-wise. And and I like you were talking to him, you're talking to Dutch as Arthur, and all of a sudden I look and I saw that there was a possible dialogue option with Dutch. So, but by the time I looked into that corner and I saw what it was, and I saw there was 2 questions I could ask him, and by the time I decided on what question to ask, the dialogue option went away. And I felt like I was sort of in a way cheated out of a story beat that could have been really cool and could have been a nice little way to be able to kind of interact with Dutch. And maybe I didn't know at the time, but it could have maybe had some a choice that I made with regards to the question that I asked could have had an impact later. I did play it again, and I realized it was just basically it was just an additional flavor sort of text sort of thing. But I felt like when I first saw it and when I first played it, I felt like I was missing out on something. And it was because of just how small it was. It was just hard for me to be able to, and just the reaction time I had of it, it was hard for me to be able to keep playing it. And so by the time that I got to chapter 2 within the story, and it just wasn't really progressing so much, and I was struggling with more the accessibility than necessarily the story or the gameplay itself. Actually, the gameplay was kind of like the hardest because everything was in that interactive menu at the bottom right, and there was many times, especially with the PS4, and the fact that for me, visually, the square and circle buttons look so similar in that interactive menu that there was many times I was pushing circle when I was supposed to be pushing square, and vice versa, that it was like I was making mistakes and I was hitting the wrong choice to be able to talk to someone, especially when I think when I'm having to just greet strangers in a town, and I always wanted to be able to greet them in a very polite sort of way, and I always knew that I figured out that was square, but at the time at the beginning when I would hit circle, I believe that was to antagonize them, and I think triangle was to rob. So when I antagonized, I'm like, no, that's not what I wanted to do. So there was many times at the beginning of playing this game with the first time that I was making those mistakes, and it was because I just couldn't be able to see properly of what those button presses were. And so and I felt that the reticle was a little bit too small and hard to see. I felt like even the colors that they used were really, really hard. And so I was struggling with it, and I didn't want to keep struggling with it just to be able to get through the story, because I felt like it would sort of wouldn't have the same impact story-wise if I had to keep fighting the lack of accessibility or the accessibility barriers within this game for me. So I stopped, and it's been sitting on my shelf for a year. I hadn't touched it, and I kept thinking I could sell this and make some money off of it, or at least get some money back for it. But I kept thinking, no, I'm gonna jump back into this at some point, and I just never pulled the trigger, pun intended, as it were, to sell this. And so I thought, and then it wasn't until like end of November, beginning December. I don't know what triggered it, pun intended, for me to be able to be like, yes, I'm going to start playing this. It may have been sort of people were playing it on PC because it just recently came out for PC, and also as well, Red Dead Online was starting to become a thing, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to give this one more try. So I started back at the beginning again. I didn't want to jump back into my old save because I didn't want to have to keep fighting with accessibility barriers, as well as trying to be able to learn the muscle memory of the interaction, or which buttons were which. And I didn't want to basically make the same mistake as I'm trying to figure out, okay, what button is it that I'm supposed to be pushing? And all of a sudden, I would be shooting somebody. And I didn't want to do that. So I started off a brand new save, and like I said, I was able to get to that point in the dialogue option with Dutch, and again, it was a cool little story moment, but it wasn't like it had a huge impact on the game itself. But I'm just gonna take a sip of coffee real quick. And so when and it's not like when I jump back in that the accessibility got better. I feel like in a small way, because of just the amount of games I've played over the past year, my skills have improved a little bit. So I felt it was a little bit easier than I had remembered. But again, like I said before, there was sort of some technical upgrades that I was able to do. And the fact that I had a bigger TV this time around, or at least a better setup for me to be able to play, where the TV was a little bit closer than it normally was, or when I first played it. Because I think I actually played it on a 27-inch monitor originally, and then I upgraded to a 42-inch monitor when I first started this. And then over the Christmas break, I purchased what I'm looking at right now, which is my computer monitor / gaming monitor. It's a 50-inch TV, and it's sitting about 1.5 feet away from me. So that also helped. And then also, what was different this time around was that I was playing it on a PS4 Pro, where I was originally playing it on a PS4. I will say this, if you're wondering about the difference between the two, there wasn't really much difference graphically wise. Yes, things were clearer and crisper on a PS4 Pro, being able to play it in 4K. But the only difference I saw was more of the draw distance. So a lot of it sort of like you're not able to see far off in the distance with a PS4, whereas in a PS4 Pro you're able to see farther into the distance. So you're able to see like distant mountains and even details of like snow on the mountains and stuff like that. But I didn't feel like that I had lost out on a cool sort of like graphical like look to the game when jumping from a PS4 to a PS4 Pro. But it does help. It's a nice looking upgrade for sure. And the game is gorgeous. Regardless, the game is gorgeous regardless whether you're on a PS4 or PS4 Pro. And I just think that if you have the option to be able to play in 4K or on an Xbox One X or even on a higher end PC or on a PS4 Pro, I definitely recommend it because you do get a lot more graphic bang for your buck, as it were. So when I jump back in to the story with those sort of technical upgrades that I had, it did become a little bit easier for me to see because text was still small, but it was a little bit more legible for me. And I also utilized the PlayStation Zoom option when I was playing this, which is something that's built into the system where you can be able to hit the PS button and the square button at the same time, and it will turn on the zoom feature where you can use the left thumbstick to be able to move around this, like basically move your view around the screen to be able to see things a little bit more clearly. It's not robust in any way. You can't adjust your zoom level. It's only one zoom multiplication. So I think it's like 2 times zoom, and that's it. You can't adjust it at all. And then the only thing you can do is just turn it on and off. And it helped a lot for a lot of things that like the tooltips or the on the top left corner. Whenever I had to be able to read something, I just sort of would turn that on so I can be able to see what it says. There would be some times where it would disappear before I could be able to actually read it fully. But for the majority of the time, that was how I was able to read those sections of the game within the HUD itself. I knew that there was like a Red Dead Redemption 2 app where you can be able to have like a map up and running and stuff like that, and you're able to use that. I tried it at first when I first played it, but I didn't for this playthrough, mainly just because with the screen that I had and with the upgrade I had, and it being pretty close, I was able to at least read the map a little bit easier than previously. So that was sort of my thinking of jumping back into the game again. And there was something that happened in the story-wise. So I'm going to jump into the story of this. So if you haven't played it through to the end of the Epilogue Part 2, basically when you get to the end credits of the game, I would recommend definitely you stop watching this or listening to this right now. If you are listening to this, I applaud you for risking yourself to get in it, because it does say it's a spoiler cast in the title of this. So if you haven't played it, this is your chance to be able to jump off it and go play yourself. I would say if you are on the fence about it, it doesn't. I will say I completed the game. I completed the main story of the game. This doesn't sort of say that because I, as a disabled gamer, was able to, or a blind gamer was able to play this, that you can too. I never want to be able to portray, give that as the intention of what I'm saying. It's it would, if you can take it for what you will. It's very rare that I can actually be able to play a game and complete the story because of my disability and other things, are just other factors. So the fact that I'm able to, like, there are very few games I was able actually to complete and roll credits on, and but this game is one that I was able to. So you can take that with what you will. I do recommend it. It's an amazing game, and it's very much up there when it comes to the original Red Dead Redemption. I would say it probably, in regards to some of the gameplay, I feel like that maybe Red Dead Redemption might be a better choice than when it comes to Red Dead Redemption 2 in comparison. Story-wise, they're both amazing stories, different stories and different pacing for the stories, but I would say it's right up there with it's an amazing game, and it definitely deserved, in my opinion, a lot of the awards that it got of Game of the Year for 2018. And I was upset. I was upset at the time because I felt like the 2018 had an amazing year for games. When you're talking like just as a few examples: God of War, Marvel's Spider-Man, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. There was so many great games that came out in 2018, and yet for some reason I was like, really, this game won? Because there was some people that didn't really like this, and I was like, what? Like, why did it win so many awards? I'm like, now I get it. Now I understand why, and yes, I would agree. So take that with what you will. If you want to be able to pick it up and play it, there's your chance to be able to get out now before any spoilers happen. Without any further ado, so let's jump into the story. So now we're into spoiler territory. There is one line in the entire game that I feel like sums up the 100% the story of Arthur and the Vanderlyn gang, and sort of this is what unlocked the character of Arthur Morgan for me. At first, when I played this, Arthur Morgan was someone I did not want to be able to play. He was a bad dude. He was a bad guy. Duh. I'm gonna take a sip for that. That was a bad joke. He was an outlaw, and I felt like that I wasn't able to have a lot of agency with Arthur. Arthur didn't feel like it was my character, like John Marston was when I first played Red Dead 1, or Red Dead Redemption. You felt like that John Marston, essentially, he was a bad guy. He was an outlaw, and he's changing his ways, and he's roped back in again into his past, and he's sort of trying to redeem himself from his past. And so you had the full option of whether you can go completely bad again, or you can go try to be able to go completely good. And for me, I always go completely good. There's only one time I actually went bad in a game, and that was Star Wars Knights of the Republic, and that was after I'd already played the game through as the like on the light side. I decided to go back in and play completely dark, and that was the first and only time I ever did that. I've never played an RPG where I played a bad guy since. And so with Arthur, the fact that yes, there was some agency that you had over the character. Rockstar took kind of like a Last of Us approach, where essentially you're playing as Joel and Ellie, or you're playing as Joel, and you're not really necessarily Joel. You're just in his boots, as it were, in his shoes. You didn't have full control over Joel, because it was the story that sort of take over. And I kind of felt that was the same way with Arthur Morgan. Rockstar had a very specific story to tell with Arthur, and you were along for the ride, as it were. And I was a little bit, and Greg Miller kind of talked about this, and how much of an impact Red Dead had on him and the decisions he made, and it sort of like, it changed the way he thought about Red Dead. And then when he jumped into Red Dead 2, he felt like that he didn't want to be a bad guy. He wanted to at least have some choice in the matter of becoming a good guy, instead of having to go in and basically do all these missions, robbing people and taking money from them and killing them or beating them up and stuff like that. And I felt the same way when I was playing it. I was just like, I just don't like Arthur as a character. I just didn't like it at first. And then jumping back into it again, starting from scratch, there was one line that I feel like that sums up, and this is what switched around the character for me. This is what made me realize who Arthur was and what what I can do as a player to sort of lead him into the direction of a redemption story. And it was at the very beginning. It's shortly after that they had rescued Sadie Adler from the O'Driscolls. They were walking. They're walking outside after the house is burning down, and Dutch puts the a blanket over top of Sadie, and Arthur grabs her by the shoulders and is about to put her onto a horse, and he says, and I had to look this up because I wanted to get the quote right. He says, "We're bad men, but we ain't them." He was talking about the O'Driscolls and themselves, but I feel like that is the crux of that was the justification of Arthur and the decisions that he made throughout the entire game, or leading up to this story, and throughout this entire time, is that Arthur knew he was a bad dude. Arthur knew that he was that he was making these bad decisions. But he sort of was desensitized to it because they had to do this to survive. But seeing what the O'Driscolls do as a gang, and they had there's no care for anybody else other than themselves. He felt that at least with the Vanderlyn gang, it was more of a excuse me, I had to burp there. It was more of a community and a family than necessarily a gang, which is what the O'Driscolls were. The O'Driscolls were more of a gang than necessarily a family or community. And that line, once I kind of heard that again, it was and I ignored it the first time, but as soon as I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, this is Arthur. We're bad men, but we have some dignity. Like, and even there was even a one point in Red Dead Redemption where John talks about the Dutch's gang and sort of and their philosophy in that they would rob people, yes they would rob banks and stuff, but they would always rob rich people to be able to help the poor. It's sort of like a Robin Hood type scenario, and you got to see that in action in this game. There were definitely some moments where I feel like that were unnecessarily, especially like I think Greg Miller even mentioned this as well in his sort of review of it, was that they were robbing a train and it just sort of like there was a civilian on there, and one of them says, give him a beating, Arthur, and it'd be like, make sure we get our money, and you had to do it. Actually, I think at one point, if you just don't do it, someone else would. One of the other characters would, but it still didn't really, like, by not doing it, it still didn't really like change anything of the outcome of anything in the story wise. It's not like it was brought up. It's not like a little pop-up thing that says that Dutch will remember that kind of thing. It was never anything like that. But it sort of allowed me to understand who Arthur was at the beginning of this game. Especially when you get out of the mountains and you go into Valentine and that whole chapter 2 section, which I think is the longest chapter of the game, and you're doing all these things. You're breaking Micah out of jail. You're collecting debts from Strauss, and you're basically like you're doing all these things. You're planning out this sort of next big score to get the Vanderlyn gang out of the state that they're in, and literally and figuratively. I sort of understood it, and then and I didn't think about it at the very beginning but there was one sort of debt collection mission that you do with Strauss that that had an impact on me that I didn't think that it would become a thing later until much later, was that when you were visiting Mr. Downs and his family. and he's dying, and you don't realize it's tuberculosis until later, and it comes up later that's what happened to Arthur, and that's where he got it from. It's sort of innocuous, and it's like unless you go back and look at it, you're like, oh yeah, now I see that was the moment that, like, when he spits into his face, and then later on when he's riding away, you can see him wipe his mouth, and you don't, like, it's so subtle and extremely subtle that unless you knew what happened, you wouldn't have caught it. It would have been something that was missed, but you sort of. Just the way that Arthur treats that family, it was a means to an end. In his mind, Arthur was in the right. He knew he was doing something bad. He knew he was, but his philosophy was, hey, you borrowed money from us. You owe us this money. You are paying this money right now. We gave you all these chances to be able to pay the money. We gave you all the opportunities to, and now we're here to collect, and we want our money. And you don't see the impact that it was having until much later. And at first I was sort of like, okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. They borrowed money. They should have paid it back. And it's just like I was already in the character of Arthur. I was like, yes. This is a means to an end. We need money. We need as much money as possible to get out of here. And damned if anyone gets into our way, because we as a family, we as a community, we need to survive. And following Dutch this entire time, the change of what was happening to Dutch. Some people argue that essentially he just slowly becomes crazy and insane, and some people would argue that this is just now, or he was by the end of the game, he's become what he's been like all along. It's just everyone was blindly following, pun intended, blindly following Dutch this entire time. And I can sort of see that, because as Arthur, and you're following Dutch and you're loyal to Dutch, you've been loyal to Dutch for a majority of your life. And I sort of, even though they kind of said it like it was sort of like an older brother type relationship between Dutch and Arthur, I kind of felt more of like that Dutch and Hosea were more surrogate fathers to Arthur. And then the rest of the gang were brothers and sisters. And so Arthur was already essentially indoctrinated into the gang, and I love that there are moments in the story that essentially kind of show Arthur what the world is like when you have those kind of people in charge, like Dutch, like when you're having to go through Mary's mission and you're rescuing Mary's brother from that cult, and you see the leader of the cult, and it's like, yeah, of course the cult leader's crazy. Like, this is insane. Why would you even follow someone like this? And Arthur says, tells Mary's brother, like, do something with your life. Like, don't fall into this nonsense. And then you see even to the extreme of Rain's Fall later on, and sort of like you see what a leader of a group of people should be like. And at this point, you're really doubting Dutch a lot, and you now get to sort of take a step back and see what, with his own eyes of like, oh yeah, this is what a leader should be like. And just they're sort of even actually in the example of the Greys and the Braithwaites, like at the time you're sort of like, these families are idiots. Like, they're just basically, it's just such a long feud that no one even remembers or even cares about how it started. It's just they just know they hate each other, and you're like, that just can't happen to us. That can't happen to the Vanderlyn gang. It's like we're okay. But there was many examples of like, this is what, like, and the game and the story was showing us, this is what is going to happen. Like, this is what's going to happen if you just blindly follow someone. And I felt that was like, I didn't think about this during the game or during the story. I thought about this more afterwards. And it just bit by bit, at each story and each sort of little side mission you start to see that there was so many different parallels to what was happening to Dutch that unfortunately Arthur didn't see it until it was too late. And I think there was one review, I think it was GameSpot that said in their Spoilercast, I can't remember who specifically said it, but they had said that Dutch was very much kind of like the leader, and the rest of the gang was sort of his apostles. And because especially with Dutch mentioning faith a lot and like, have faith in me, I've always got a plan, I've always got something in mind, I've worked this whole thing out. And at first you're like, yeah, okay, sure, if it, like, your plans have worked in the past, as far as I knew, and we're able to get like, but I think it was the Blackwater incident that essentially, like, each thing you do, even though you were successful in certain things, there was a lot of missions where you failed. There's a lot of jobs that you had failed in this game that basically unraveled the entire gang. And just and all Dutch kept saying was that he had a plan. And then, like, at first you're like, yep, okay, Dutch has a plan. Not everything goes to plan. It's fine, but he has a plan and he's going to get us out of it. And then by the end of it, when you sort of take a step back and you're not part of the plan anymore as Arthur, you're like, oh no, Dutch doesn't have a plan. He's in this for himself, and he doesn't care. Like, he only cares about himself. And even when there were certain points where when essentially, like, he would do anything for the protection of the gang. Like at the beginning chapters in Valentine, you find out that essentially that Micah got captured, and then also Sean was left in Blackwater, and all throughout basically Dutch kept saying, like, if you're not doing those missions right away, Dutch would say, hey, what about Sean? We got to go get Sean. What about Micah? You got to go get Micah. Like, he was always in trying to be able to make sure that his community and his gang was together. And then seeing, like, even to the epitome of that extreme where Jack got captured by the Braithwaites, and you're walking up towards the Braithwaite's house, which was a badass moment. Like, oh my God, like, having those people, like, having the entire gang and like this sort of one line walking, like, marching up towards the house, and then that whole mission, and then you just sort of leave it with the with burning down the entire Braithwaite's estate, and the wailing of Catherine Braithwaite, of just what she had lost. I was like, oh, if they're willing to do that for Jack, yeah, like that like, we're in this together. We'll make sure that there's no man or woman or child left behind. And then it was after that even on Guarma, being able to pick up, like, they were like, we need to grab Javier, and it sort of, like, there was nothing that needed, like, nothing else needed to be done but getting a Javier. And then later on, seeing the switch of, like, John getting captured, Abigail getting captured, and Dutch not even wanting to lift a finger. It's like, yeah, we'll get to it, especially with John. Or, no, we got to abandon Abigail. Abigail's not in this anymore. We got to get rid of her. And then it was just like, you start to see who Dutch really is, and when he was in it for himself, and sort of, and it could be said, like, oh, that was Micah's influence. Sure, yeah, I get it. Like, some people can sort of argue that, and I would not I'm not putting this all on Dutch. I'd say, like, a good percentage of it is definitely Micah as well. But Micah was sort of, I think, feeding that ego. And you know what? Actually, it completely kind of sums up where Dutch sort of felt like, or like his character progression throughout the entire game was, I felt like that at a certain point, Dutch felt like that he was like a god. That even though there's so many things that was happening to the gang, there was they were facing so many failures in each of the jobs they tried to build to do. It felt like, I think Dutch felt like that he was still untouchable. He can talk his way, he can manipulate his way out of any situation he was in, and he was always able to survive. And I think he sort of saw, and that ego fed into that, and he probably felt like he was untouchable, that he was he was indestructible. And I kind of felt like that, yeah, even up into the story of Red Dead, and seeing Dutch, like, still, like, even at the end of his life, he still felt like that. I think that he felt like that he was a god amongst men. And throughout this entire time, as Arthur, you slowly start to see that happen. And the way they sort of set it up into this game, or into this story, was absolutely brilliant. It was true Western storytelling at its best. I wanted to actually, like, break down into each sort of story section. Like, I have my notes here, and I wanted to talk about the beginning chapters, the Grace and Braithwaites, and the Saint Denis and Guarma, and back, like come back and all that stuff. But I think I'm just sort of kind of like more an overview of what I felt like of the story, and kind of using different examples. And I think that that definitely talked about it. I do want to talk about sort of the now back to, like, we talked about Dutch for a little bit. I want to talk about Arthur as a character, because once you finally started having agency over Arthur, and you're seeing all the good things that you were trying to do, and you're like, at least for me, I played with high honor as much as possible, and I think I almost got 100% a high honor. I think it was like maybe 80-90% there. I think the last little bit was probably because there was just a lot of missions that I didn't do, like a lot of stranger stuff, like stranger missions that I just didn't get to, or didn't necessarily. I just was like, I wasn't interested in it, so I just didn't do it. So I probably could have went full 100% high honor, but at least I was at that point where essentially by the end of the game I had the equivalent of the high honor ending, as it were. But like I said, kind of going back to that first line of "we're bad men, but we ain't them," and then realizing that the game, that Dutch was becoming one of those men that Arthur had despised. He was becoming like a Colm Driscoll, and realizing all the bad that Arthur has done. Like he always said, he believed that it was like, hey, I'm damned. I'm damned to hell, and I'm just gonna wreak havoc until I do. And then when he was sort of faced with his mortality by getting tuberculosis, which I thought was kind of brilliant, by the way, of like how subtle they kind of started that. With all of a sudden, it's like you sort of like, wait, did he just cough just then? What was that? And then he just kept coughing throughout, and then just how a GameSpot, actually, the GameSpot review of this was Spoilercast review. This kind of brought up this point that I had thought about too, was that it was so funny that this entire time you had this mechanic of like, you got to keep eating, you got to sleep to be able to make sure that your weight is at a certain point, so that your health is at its peak optimacy, and you want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And I was like, you get so invested in that. And I was like, okay, that's a gameplay mechanic. That's just part of the game, as it were, quote unquote. And I thought that was cool. But then when you get tuberculosis, and then you now are like, oh shoot, all that entire time of making sure that Arthur was healthy, and now he can't, even to the point where he can't eat as much, he can't drink as much anymore, and he can't use even when he tries to be able to get full health or full stamina, he can't, because it'll only go to a certain level, because he was getting sick, and and you could see his body start to deteriorate. And I was like, that was a cool way of doing it. If Rockstar had set it up like that was what they were like. That was sort of their plan all along, was to be able to give Arthur tuberculosis, and they were like, let's build a mechanic around that, and not even introduce this until like 3/4 of the way through the game. I was like, bravo. The fact that they did that on purpose the entire time, then I'm like, kudos. That was a cool way to be able to implement and to that mechanic into the game itself, instead of just feeling like that was sort of just a way to be able to improve your stats, as it were, of Arthur. So I got to give Rockstar credit for that. But then also, as like I said, when Arthur sort of was met with his mortality, realizing that he was gonna die soon. Because even at this point, antibiotics wasn't invented until 20 years later, and they were only just starting to sort of experiment with cures for tuberculosis. And actually I looked it up, and apparently, like, yeah, no, tuberculosis is still a thing that can happen, but it takes like up to like 9 months of just taking constant antibiotics to make sure that you don't die. Like that's how bad this disease was. I actually thought that tuberculosis could have been cured by a dry weather climate, because I grew up on a story. There was a show in Canada called Road to Avonlea, and there's one character that at one point one of the daughters of Cecily King essentially at one point gets tuberculosis, and I think there was sort of a way for them to be able to kind of write off the character, and they sent Cecily into a sanatorium, but she was able to be cured from tuberculosis because they sent her to a sanatorium that was basically in a dry climate, where sort of like they're able to like breathe fresh air and all that, and I was and not have to like, and I was like, oh, that's so that's all Arthur needs, was just basically go into a dry environment, live there for a long time, and then his tuberculosis would not come back, or he would be cured from it. I didn't realize how brutal this disease really was, and then when sort of Arthur was dealt with that, and he realized that he and there was one conversation that really hit me, and you don't get it unless you do the Brother Dorkins missions in Saint Denis. You're introduced to it by the Reverend in camp, and you get to do Brother Dorkins, but you meet in the second mission, you meet a nun who a kid had stolen a crucifix, and you go and get it back for her. And then when you go back when you get a letter from Beau and Penelope Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite to help them leave Lemoyne County, or the Lemoyne State, as it were, so they can be able to go and live life together. When you take them to a train station, you see the nun, and you have a conversation with the nun, and it's the first time for me at this point in the game, it was the first time that he actually said out loud to anybody else other than the doctor that he has tuberculosis and that he's dying. And he said that, and Arthur said that he was afraid. He was not afraid of dying, but he was afraid that of what he had become, and he didn't believe in anything anymore. He didn't believe in Dutch, and that was his sort of constant. That was his North Star throughout his entire life. A majority of his adult life was following Dutch. That was something he believed in, and then when he sort of saw who Dutch really was, he felt like that everything that he had done for Dutch, or even for himself, wasn't helping people. And the nun tried to convince him, was like, no, you are a good man. You are a good man. You can do right in this world by helping people. And I never and it really kind of became true when you essentially go on the Rains Fall section of the game, and you're helping him out, and you even had that conversation also with Rains Fall about Arthur's family and the fact that he used to have a son and a wife, and they're dead, and they through very tragic means, and Rains Fall sort of encourages him, and and it was so subtle too. It's like, because the way they start off these things in this game, it starts off extremely subtle. Like the when you meet the Downs family, and that's where you got tuberculosis, and then when you sort of see the Rains Fall for the first time in Saint Denis, and with Evelyn Miller as with the author, and he's trying to be able to implore the local government to be able to see the plight that the Native Americans were under. And it's like, oh, when I first saw it, I'll fully admit, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. It's a Western. Of course, they're going to talk about Native Americans at least at some point in this, and kind of the tragedy of what was happening to the people at that time, even still today. It was just like, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's, of course they would add that into it, and I didn't think much of it. And then when you meet them again, and then you realize what they were going through, and even just in a very small encapsulated way of just sort of I think it was Colonel Fellows. I can't remember his name, but the colonel and sort of him kicking off the Wapiti tribe because Leviticus Cornwall wanted oil. And that was exactly what it was basically at that point, like after I met the nun on the train station, ever since then, I made a concerted effort to be able to try to do as much good as possible. I felt like at this point, you know what? Like I was with Arthur this entire time. Yes, we did some bad stuff, but I'm gonna make sure that before I die, I'm gonna help as many people as possible. And I felt like that Rain's Fall was sort of like that way, like the repeated thing story was what I could do this. I can make this right. I can make something right in this world before I kick this mortal coil, and then realizing that you're now also on the outside of Dutch's decisions. Like Dutch used to rely on you so much, even to the point like up into when they were living at Shady Bell, and you were and you get asked like you're having a discussion with Dutch and Hosea, and you're asked, what do you think we should do? I went with Hosea instead of Dutch specifically. I didn't realize that like that was sort of that was sort of a breaking point within story-wise. It could have not been. I don't know. It just felt like to me story-wise it did. But it like I felt like I could fix this. And then now being outside of Dutch's decision making, like I had no idea what Dutch was doing at all. All I cared about was I need to help these people out. And like even the fact that Charles was helping me, I felt like, okay, good. At least there's some people on my side on this. And then like everything you would do for Rain's Fall, and then you would go back to Dutch, and it's like Dutch had basically kind of screwed everything up, and he was using his manipulation against Eagle Flies, and it's just like, oh, come on. It's like, no, we're screwing these people over. And Dutch was manipulating Eagle Flies much like he did with the Greys and Braithwaites. It's like trying to be able to pit each other at these throats, and Dutch was using the Wapiti tribe against the U.S. government or the U.S. Army, and like in the very same way. And it's like, no, this is not right. This is not the way it's supposed to go, the way it's supposed to happen. And then when you finally, when it comes to that confrontation where Rain's Fall shows up at what's the place? I can't remember what's called. It shows up to your camp, and he's like, Arthur, you helped me before. Can you please help me again? Eagle Flies is I need you to help save him. And then Dutch is like, what have you been doing this entire time? And it's like, wait, you've been helping them out? And it's like, at that point, it's like, yeah, of course I've been doing that, Dutch, because these people need our help. And then it's like, it was a really cool moment. And then when you get to that, when Eagle Flies sort of like you're kind of forced to go into that mission where you're invading that oil factory, and then you get caught or ish, and you're about to like get stabbed in the face, and you see Dutch just walk away. Out of all the good that Arthur had done, out of all the things he was trying to do to keep the gang together, Dutch just walked away. And I will admit, I completely sobbed. I started to cry because, again, I felt like that Dutch was a father figure to Arthur, and I'll say this: I have a great relationship with my dad. He's still around to this day, and I have nothing but like I love my dad very much. But I sort of felt the pain that Arthur was going through. It's like, why'd you do this to me, Dad? Why'd you leave me like that? And then when he confronts them afterwards, and Dutch is like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then you just sort of like, and you had to let it go. I was just like, oh, like that hurt. And then the whole leading up to the end, when you find out that even when John was captured and put into prison, and you're like, and Dutch is like it doesn't like, we'll get to him later. I'm like, no, you gotta get to him now. He's gonna be hanged, and there's talk that he's gonna be hanged, and Dutch is like, there was talk. It's like, you would have done this like weeks ago. You would have done the same thing. It didn't matter if they were talking about it. You needed to get him out now. And the fact that Arthur and Sadie went out and got him, and then he brought him back, and then it's just sort of like, and then like even when he had to go and when Abigail was captured, and Dutch was like, we gotta leave her behind. We got like, and then Arthur's like, what are you talking about? We've been trying to help out these, like we're trying to keep ourselves together. Like, what are you doing? Like we like weeks ago, months ago, we would have dropped everything to be able to bring back one of our own, regardless of whether it was a trap or not. And when Dutch did that, I was like, again, it just sort of felt like that. Dad, why are you doing this? Why? And then finding out that Micah was the one that betrayed, and then when you're in that final confrontation, and you made the decision that no, this gang is now over. People have already left, and people have already picked sides, and then it's like, then you get to that final, like, and then the Pinkertons arrive again. And you're now, and you have that decision. Do you help John? Do you go after the money? And that's the thing too. Even when you find out that, oh yeah, no, John was killed in that train robbery, and then you think that, and like, of course I knew that he wasn't because I played Red Dead Redemption and I know that he's the main character. But if no one's played it, that would have been a completely different. Like that would have been like, oh shoot, really? You just let him die? Or that, no, he died, and it's like, like you couldn't save him, and then he comes back, and it's like, you left me, and John's like, you left me, because I feel like that Arthur and John had the same kind of relationship with Dutch, and that Dutch was a father figure to them, and even, you know what, even I'm going to talk briefly about even the character progression of how Arthur felt about John at the very beginning of the game, and where they ended up. I thought that was a beautiful way of storytelling, because at first it's like, okay, I get it. Arthur doesn't like John because it's like you don't want to put too much like, oh look, it's John, because he's in the first game. It's like, so like I like that. I didn't like that twist, sort of, and to a certain degree, but I was like, I get it. And then as the game kind of progressed, and it's like, and I think it was the moment where John had suggested putting the oil tank in front of on the tracks so that the train would stop so they can be able to rob it. And then when Arthur was like, you know what, that is a brilliant idea. And it was like he realized that John was very much kind of like Arthur in that sense, and he felt like he was a true John. I think at that moment, that's when Arthur started to feel John like was a true brother. And you leading up all to that moment when you have to decide between, do you help John or do you go after the money that Dutch has been saving this entire time? I gotta take a drink, sip of coffee. It's cold now, but it's still okay. Immediately, of course, the only decision I could make was, I gotta help John. I gotta help John escape, because John had more to lose, and he had an opportunity to get out. He had a family. He had Abigail. He had Jack. And I believe that, like, Arthur, it's like throughout this entire time, it's like, we need to get you out of here. We need to get, like, you have a better chance at living life. And it sort of goes back to Arthur trying to make amends for all the bad things he did, and including, like, what he did with Rain's Fall, what he did with Bo and Penelope Braithwaite, or Bo Gray and Penelope Braithwaite, what he did with all the people that he helped in just the small little missions here and there, and even with the Downs family, even though he screwed them over so much, he did everything he could to be able to make sure that he was trying, like, he tried to fix it. And it's like, he knew that he reaped what he sowed, and seeing what they had done, and all this entire time, he felt like that John was sort of like, if he can help John, and if that's the last thing he did, then at least his life was worth something. Instead of being a bad man, he wasn't going to become a complete, like, he was going to become them. And that whole ending of the fight with Micah, and when Dutch shows up and he walks away again. At this point, I hadn't stopped at this point. I hadn't stopped crying since when that sort of montage of Arthur riding to camp, and you hear all the voices of all the people that you helped in the game of saying Arthur's a good man, and he does, and he can do the right thing in this, and that, like, I started weeping and I didn't stop leading up into the very end. And it's like, even at the very end, I cried even more when it was like, again, Dutch just left. He was so selfish. He didn't care about anybody else anymore. He only cared about himself. And I got the high honor ending. So I got the one where he where basically Arthur just kind of died from basically tuberculosis and just all the injuries that he had sustained from being beaten up by Micah, and you sort of see the sunrise, and like, so that was the ending I got. No, there was like three others. There was one that where you get stabbed by Micah on the cliff, and then there's one that if you go back, there's two that if you go back to them for the money, that, I mean, you still basically die by a horrific sort of way, but I think basically you get shot, or you get definitely stabbed like multiple times by Micah in one of those, but I can't remember what the other one was. But essentially, I had the high, like the good ending, as it were. And oh God, that broke me. That whole last bit broke me, and I realized just how the tragedy of Arthur Morgan and what he tried to do to make things right and to make amends. Like, there's so many subtle things that this game did to and sort of like parallels to Arthur and to Dutch and to Arthur and John and to the rest of the gang and his community. And there's the storytelling of this was done in a very beautiful way, and I'm glad that at least Rockstar spent 5 years trying to put this one together, because they could have very easily just slapped together a sequel and it would have been that, but they took the time. They took 5 years to put this together, and you can see the effort, and you can see how much care that Rockstar had for this story. And I felt like that was the not necessarily the ending I wished would have happened. I wish that Arthur would have survived, but I was satisfied with the ending that I got. Now, to talk about the epilogue, I think if you hadn't played Red Dead Redemption, this epilogue was kind of superfluous. It could have been narrowed down into something very quickly, because there was certain, because being able to, especially more of seeing where everyone ended up, seeing where Sadie ended up, seeing where Charles and Uncle, and seeing the whole story with Micah, and finding Micah again, and then even seeing Dutch again, and the fact that Dutch was with Micah all along, and then he just walked away again after he shot Micah. It's like, yeah, okay, great, but then you just walked away again. Damn it, Dutch! But I felt like that it was the 7 to 10 hours of gameplay that you played in the epilogue. It was more fan service for those who had played Red Dead Redemption, and you're setting up this entire sort of story of John Marston and all leading up to essentially the moment where John is now is forced to work with the new Federal Bureau of Investigations. Instead of the Pinkertons, as it were, and you leading up to the events of Red Dead Redemption. I think, yeah, if you hadn't played Red Dead Redemption, it would kind of the epilogue wasn't really. I don't think it was worth much. I think it was just more set up for those who had played it, and you get to see sort of the progression of what happened after the gang leading up to where John was at the beginning of Red Dead Redemption. And I didn't mind it. I personally, like I said, as a fan of the first one, I liked the idea of ranching and farming and building the house and then seeing the barn that he that he essentially is like a few years later he's gonna die, and that, like, I stood in that same spot and I was like, ooh. And I didn't realize even until much later when at the very end of the credits, when you go back into the game and you have that quick conversation of John and Abigail. I didn't know this until later. I completely had forgotten that they're standing essentially on the very spot where their graves are eventually going to be. I think that was a beautiful, subtle touch. I didn't catch that until I heard about it later in a YouTube video, but I thought, oh, that was pretty cool. I kind of wish I caught it in the moment, but I did catch the barn, and at the moment I stood in front of that, and I actually turned around and had my back to the barn, and I could see like all the cinema. I was like, yeah, this is where all the guys stood in front of me and basically shot me dead. Or shot John dead, and I was just like, wow. Like, it was, and like I said, it was the epilogue was more fan service. So I think if you were to play the game and you were to like you weren't necessarily a Red Dead Redemption fan, I think that the story, I think the true ending is the ending of Arthur's story. The epilogue was just sort of as a bonus, I felt. I would have been okay with that even if that was a DLC sort of thing. I think, yeah, there were moments that were pretty cool, like going off with Sadie, having Charles basically and Uncle being there, even though Uncle's very annoying. I agreed with that. And then the whole, like, when you get to sort of, and the proposal with Abigail was so good. And the fact that he gave Abigail the same ring that Arthur gave to his wife, or to marry. I think it was to marry. Yeah, like to marry for the engagement. I was like, oh, that was so good. And then the whole leading up to Micah, and then you hear the original Red Dead Redemption theme as you're going up the mountain to confront Micah, and you finally get to kill Micah at the end. I was like, that was satisfying. So there's moments that I think that would have been great to be able to add in. I think maybe that could have made the epilogue a little bit shorter, but I think, yeah, it was just like, it was more fan service than anything, and I don't think that it was necessary for the majority of that time you spent. Could have been like maybe an hour or two shorter, or actually an hour or two total. But I think it was okay. It was not necessary, but it was nice as a Red Dead Redemption fan. Yeah. So I think that's kind of it. And I even sort of, I liked the credit montages throughout it. I was even like seeing the investigators basically like finding their way through each sort of town and trying to find John Marston, and then eventually at the end when you see that they had approached Beecher's Hope, and they're like, you know, that's what's leading up to the events of Red Dead Redemption. I was like, okay, yeah. Even though I know that in the end, Abigail and John and Jack only had a certain amount of time together, at least they had at least a decent amount of time together instead of like right away. I think that at least, I think they had like a total of like 11 years after the events of the gang, that at least they were together. So I was satisfied in that they were able to kind of stay together for that long, even though they died shortly thereafter. This game. My thoughts about this is that Red Dead Redemption 2 is definitely on the list of one of my favorite games of all time. And I struggle, actually, you know what, to be able to put this podcast together, this Spoilercast together, because it is just by myself, and I don't have people I can sort of like talk to that it was that fresh in people's minds that they would want to be able to talk about Red Dead Redemption 2. And I actually, technically, this is the second recording I did. I actually had a full-blown recording of ready to go. I actually record, like, as of recording this, I recorded it the full thing yesterday, and I had uploaded it, and it was scheduled and ready to go. But I was thinking about it like last night before I went to bed, and I realized that no, there were certain things I feel like that I could have, I basically did a disservice to this game, and I just sort of rambled. And I know I rambled quite a bit in this, but at least it was enough for me to be able to jot some notes down that I felt like so I can make sure I can remember, so I can talk to you about it in a coherent manner, and just hopefully being able to explain how much this game meant to me. Not only just the fact that I was able to beat it and play it, even with the lack of accessibility and the disability barriers that I had within this game. It was it was one of those stories I just like, once I finally got past that chapter 2 spot of where I was before, I couldn't put it down. I started this beginning of I think end of November, beginning of December of 2019, and I basically had just finished it a few days ago, in 20, or first week of January 2020. If you're listening to this or watching this much later. And so it basically took me about a month to be able to complete it. And I couldn't put it down. It was one of those games I didn't really play anything else really as much at all. Like, this was the one game that I just, like, I need to constantly keep playing. Like, even to the point where I actually had uploaded my save to PS Plus, so I can be able to go when I went home for to my family for the holidays. I stayed at my sister and my brother-in-law's place, and my brother-in-law had a PS4, and he was cool with me continuing my playthrough of Red Dead. So I played that for a couple hours. So I didn't want to let it go. I wanted to keep playing. That was the one game I wanted to keep playing quite a bit. So I wanted to convey how much this game meant to me. It was one of the best stories that I'd ever played in a video game. Anything that can sort of make me emotionally attached to a character or to a story or to a game, I'm all on board with. And here's the thing too, is that I hadn't really mentioned it before, but Westerns mean a lot to me. I love Western stories. And to the point where there was a period of time in my life that I actually have two two novel / stories, like Western stories, and one's completely finished. One is completely finished, and like it's a first draft, and the other one, another one hasn't been finished. And yeah, because if you surprise, if you didn't know, there was a period of time where I actually was an author, and I was writing a lot of fiction, and there was two stories that I wrote in Westerns that I may put out someday. But I don't know. I have to reread it again, and maybe I need an editor essentially to be able to put that draft into a more publishable type scenario. But the Westerns mean a lot to me, and so and you don't get a lot of them in video games. Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2 essentially are the two quintessential Western games, Old West games essentially. And this game and the first one means a lot to me. It hit at a specific time in my life. At the beginning, when I started playing it in 2010, 2011, it was just shortly before I stopped playing video games altogether, because I felt like that the disability or the accessibility in games was not like I felt like at the time I suck at video games. Why am I playing this? I'm not playing this as often. I was focused on a career, so I felt like that video games was I can put this down. I was a casual gamer at best. I can stop playing this. I can stop playing the games altogether. And that was the beginning of the decade, and then now at the beginning of a new decade, and finishing the second one. At a time where video games is my life. Video games is now going to be my career for the foreseeable future. Red Dead now essentially is the signposts of where, not only just where I am personally in my life, but just career wise. And it's like each game is the beginning of a new chapter for me. In 2010, it was when I was starting out my radio career, and I was focused in on that, and that was sort of what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And now in this, my radio career is done. It's over, and this is like, I feel like that that Red Dead Redemption is the beginning each game is the beginning chapters of the beginning of each chapter of my life. So I'm very grateful for Rockstar to be able to create a game, like two games that essentially made a huge impact on me. And I thank them for making a game like this, making two great games like this. So that being said, I definitely, like I said, yeah, this game is one of my favorite games of all time. And I should probably shut up now, because if I'm just going to keep blabbing about about this game, just of how good it is if I don't. So I thank you all for watching. I thank you all for listening. If you are listening to this on a podcast, make sure you go to youtube.com/snowball and subscribe. Make sure you subscribe there. If you are watching this on youtube.com/snowball, make sure to go to the links in the description to subscribe to this podcast in either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or Stitcher. Either one of those. Basically, just whatever pod service that you use around the globe, you can be able to search for the Blind Gamer Podcast and be able to subscribe there. It would really mean a lot if you could. And yeah, so thank you so much. Make sure you let me know on social media at Steve Saylor on Twitter and on Instagram of what you thought of this episode, and what's your thoughts on Red Dead Redemption 2. Have you played it? Have you finished it? I would love to be able to know your thoughts. Please know that essentially, please be kind in the comments down below for those who may not have been able to play it as of yet. So I mean it's a spoiler cast, so you probably could. I don't know. I leave it up to you. I don't want to I don't want to ruin anyone else's experience by just randomly looking at the comments of my videos. So anyway, that's it for me. Thank you all so much for watching / listening, and as I will see you in the next one. As always, I remain obediently yours. Bye, partner.